All right, well, good morning, everyone. We are wrapping up our 3-week series on politics called Us Versus Them. I'm really excited to introduce you all to a couple of new friends of mine, Keith Simon and Patrick Miller, and we're going to have a conversation today about tribalism, about how we found ourselves here, how we're going to get out of it, what it means as followers of Jesus to think about kind of the political world that we live in right now. But I'd love to start just Keith and Patrick. Introduce yourselves and maybe tell us how you got involved in this conversation in the first place.
Well, first let me start by saying that we've had a great morning and I really appreciate you having us out here. It's fun to worship with you guys this morning. I am a recovering tribalist. I grew up in a political home in Missouri, and politics was always debated at our house. And my parents were both on the kind of what we'd think of today as the far left. So maybe I was just the contrarian kid, but I went the other way and became more conservative, much to my mother's chagrin. And I got into a point where I just thought, man, if the Republicans were in control, this world would be so much better. So 1994, there's this thing happened that was called the Republican Revolution. It was there we're going to take back the House of Representatives in the United States level. And I was sitting outside in November, mind you, in Missouri, with a friend of mine watching the election results. And when the Republicans were declared the winners of that election, they were going to be the leaders in the House, I found myself running around his backyard, waving my shirt over my head. And alcohol wasn't even involved. Well, guess what? It turns out that electing Republicans didn't solve all of the problems that I thought it was going to be, right? I became disillusioned. Like maybe there has to be a better answer than just getting a political party I favor in charge.
Yeah, my name's Patrick Miller, and I too am a recovering tribalist. However, I come from the other side of the political aisle. Both Keith and I live in Columbia, Missouri, and we both became Christians when we were 19. And shortly after becoming a Christian, I had my first opportunity to vote in a national election, which was the 2008 election between Barack Obama and John McCain. And I was a huge Barack Obama fan. In fact, he came to the university I was at and he spoke there. So I gathered together all of my friends. We met out east of campus. We walked to campus together. We were full of hope. That was his campaign slogan, of course. We were full of joy, and we thought, if he is elected, he'll change everything about our community. Columbia had a big homeless problem at the time, and I thought if we elect him, he'll institute programs that actually solve the homelessness problem around us. And seeing him was absolutely electrifying. We all came back. We all knew we were going to vote for him. But then we had to live through the next 4 years and realize that our hopes, our dreams, our aspirations didn't come to fruition. Much later than that, Keith and I were brought together in friendship. We work alongside one another, and we happen to pastor a church that's very politically diverse. We are a blue dot in a red state. You can't assume that someone who's sitting down the aisle from you voted the same way that you voted. And so by God's providence and by God's grace, we've had to learn what it looks like to pastor and lead in a politically diverse community, which is increasingly rare, and yet I think it's the very thing that Jesus could use to show the world that the church is different, because we don't divide by political lines. We're all united in him.
Amen. Yeah, so let's not get too far down the road here before we stop and actually just define what we're talking about. So you're both recovering tribalists. We're talking about tribalism. What is that? What is tribalism?
The funny thing is we wrote this book, Truth Over Tribe, and after we read it, it was published. And we never even defined tribalism.
Yeah, and I'm not letting you get off the hook.
It was
we brought you out here to make you define
moment.
it. Yeah,
you're a great author if you can write a book about a topic without defining it. So let me try to define tribalism. Let me start by saying this. We are all tribal. There is no escape from tribalism. So tribalism is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. Let's think about an animal that's not tribal, a cheetah. A cheetah is a solitary animal. And cheetahs don't do a lot of things we can do. They don't build cities. They don't sacrifice for their neighbors. They don't work for the common good. They don't build schools and orphanages and hospitals. You have to be tribal to care for other people. You have to care for those who are in your community. But you know what else cheetahs don't do? They don't build concentration camps. See, that's the dark side of tribalism. And so when we talk about tribalism, we're mostly talking about the dark side. It's exactly what this sermon series is titled. It's an us versus them mentality. And in our darkest moments, it might look like Auschwitz, but it might also just look like a really angry Facebook post.
Yeah, that's helpful. So we are tribal. We can't do anything about that. God actually made us that way. But we're interested in that dark side, in the potential evil that comes from that tribal nature. And so let's start there. Let's start by talking about how tribalism can hurt us. What are some of the biggest things that you see?
Well, one thing it's done is it's torn apart our communities, right? It's broken families, it's broken churches, it's torn apart any of our great institutions. They've all become tribal, they've all become us versus them. We have a good friend who their family likes each other, and so they get together at these big family reunions every year, and people come from all over the country to participate in this reunion. Now, I don't do family reunions. If I want to see you, I will. I don't want to have forced fun, right? But this family loved each other, and they got together, and they're having fun doing all the family reunion activities when all of a sudden somebody brought up politics. Somebody brought up President Trump. And then somebody else kind of had a smart aleck, snarky comment. Maybe there were too many Busch Lights had been consumed. I'm not exactly sure, but it kept getting more and more heated. The family reunion ended on a sour note. And usually, in years gone by, people would have forgotten before the next one came around. But thankfully, Facebook is there because Facebook allows those family reunions and the fights that happen there to go nuclear. And that's what happened. They kept the argument going after they went back to their own homes. And it got more and more heated. Finally, and you're going to think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. It got to the point where people were disinvited from weddings. One young father, young kids, had brain cancer, and he died from it. And people on the other side wouldn't even come to the funeral. So here's a family that loved each other. They got together every year, and now they can't even go to someone's funeral. That's what a little picture of what tribalism has done in so many places in our lives. It's tearing us apart. It's ruining our lives.
Yeah, and I hope there's not a lot of people here with a story that dramatic, but I bet most of us have some relationship in our life, a cousin, a son, daughter, father, where politics has come into even the most intimate relationships in our life, often for divisive ends. And one of the things we actually were talking about in this series last week was just asking the question, where has God given us real influence? And it's so tragic to me that often the areas where God's given us almost no influence, like a presidential election, we actually let it ruin the areas where he has given us a ton of influence. And like the most meaningful parts of our life often are ruined by the things that actually he hasn't really given us much say in. Let's talk a little bit more about how tribalism is hurting us. Obvious how it happens in relationships, communities. What about just in our own soul, in our own mind? What is it doing to us?
Yeah, I think tribalism, if it does anything, it makes us anxious. It makes us very fearful. But as it turns out, there's a lot of different ways to be afraid as a result of tribalism. So one story that illustrates that comes from the world of Jeopardy. There was a Jeopardy contestant named Kevin Donahue, and he had won several consecutive competitions. And at the end of one of them, he held up a kind of awkward-looking number 3 for his third victory. And no one thought anything about it, except for the once docile kings and queens of nerddom who were a part of an elite Facebook group of ex-Jeopardy contestants. When they saw his number 3, they saw it for what it really was, a white supremacist hand signal. And so they went to the producer and they said, hey, you've got to get him off of our beloved show. He's going to besmirch the entire Jeopardy franchise. And the producer said he wasn't making a hand sign like that. It was just the number 3. And so after that, they leveled up. They started making public accusations. And Kevin Donahue came out and he said, I'm not a white supremacist. I am against white supremacy. It's terrible. It's evil. And so they went one step further and they started searching through his Facebook profile and they found proof that he was, in fact, a white supremacist. He liked Frank Sinatra. And then they went a step further and they got the Anti-Defamation League involved, which is very trigger happy when it comes to lawsuits. And they said, will you please sue Jeopardy for what's happening? And when the Anti-Defamation League looked at it, they wrote them a letter and said, we're sorry to inform you, he was just holding up a number 3 for his third victory. And so what do? Do they say, yes, we got it wrong, we're sorry? No, they said, we're being gaslighted. Now, what does the story illustrate? There's 3 different kinds of anxiety. One form of anxiety is actually the anxiety experienced by the people who were attacking Kevin Donahue. It's the anxiety we feel when we think we see an injustice and we start becoming frustrated at them on the other side of the aisle. And we're anxious that something needs to be something needs to be done to stop them. Something needs to be done to resist them. We also experience anxiety if we're like Kevin Donahue. Maybe you yourself aren't being canceled, but we're afraid that I might say the wrong thing. I might offend the wrong person. And then who's going to come for me? I'll become the hunted. And then there's another kind of anxiety. You see, there were people in that Facebook group who wanted to step in and say, guys, we're being crazy. This is too far. They never did. Why? Because they were fearful that if they stood up for Kevin Donahue, they'd become just like him. That's a different kind of anxiety you feel. You might not be the one on the attack. You might not be being the one who's being attacked, but you might be afraid to step in. And so we're all living in this pool, this low-level muddle of anxiety that makes it hard to connect with others. It makes it hard for us to connect with ourselves and with God.
Well, it's a little bit of a spiral, too, because that anxiety we feel, that fear, it brings out the worst in us. We make problems worse because when we're afraid, we're more likely to tear somebody down, to lie, to justify any behavior just because we feel like the stakes are so high, we have to, And when we're all living that way, things just get worse and worse. How have you seen this reality show up in the church?
Unfortunately, becoming a partisan church has become like a growth strategy for churches. People used to come to us and try to decide if our church was a good fit for them, and they'd ask questions around the Bible. Oh, what do you believe about this or that theological doctrine? Or they might make a judgment based on your children's ministry or if they connected with the worship service. But all of a sudden, things started to change, and people started asking a totally different kind of question. They wanted to know where you stood on critical race theory. Where does this church stand on, something like George Floyd's death? Where does this church stand on defunding police? Well, all of a sudden, a whole different kind of question started coming our way. And we realized that people were making decisions about what church they wanted to go to based on a whole different set of criteria that wasn't Jesus-oriented and Christ exalting, but was instead they were looking for a church that agreed with them politically. They wanted their pastors to participate like maybe their favorite talk show host or their favorite, media person on one of the cable news programs. And then George Floyd died. And when that happened, well, I'll let Patrick pick up.
Yeah, so I won't forget the week that he died for lots of reasons, but after he was murdered, we immediately that Sunday got a message from someone who'd been a part of our church for a long time, and she said, if you don't mourn his death in your service today, I'm going to leave the church. Now, we don't do church liturgy by Facebook recommendations, so that wasn't going to change what we were going to do, but we were already planning on mourning his death. Why? Because Jesus taught us, mourn with those who mourn. That's in the Beatitudes, right? We are commanded to mourn with those who mourn. And because we had people in our congregation who were mourning what happened, we were going to participate. So we did that. And then afterwards, we get the other set of emails. People who said, you are anti-police. You want to defund the police. Now, for the record, we didn't say anything about the police when we were mourning his death. We didn't say anything about defunding the police. Now, why did all this happen? Well, like Keith said, they wanted us to sound like the scriptural pages of the New York Times, or they wanted us to sound like their favorite pastor and preacher, Tucker Carlson, whoever it was. That's what they expected from us. And they read everything we did through a political lens. So they saw what we did that Sunday morning, not as Jesus commanded us to mourn with those who mourn. They saw it as, they're trying to do something to make the left happy or to challenge the right. And that had nothing to do with what we were doing. This is why it tears apart churches, because Jesus cuts across our partisan divide. And sometimes he looks like one party, sometimes he looks like a different party, because he doesn't really care about our parties. He has a way higher, way more important job.
I mean, I think that hurts the church in so many ways. One is just in our community, it hurts us because we can't love each other and we can't serve one another because we've created enemies out of our own brothers and sisters based on political lines. But I think it also hurts the Big C church and our witness in the world outside of us, where what's so beautiful about the gospel, what's so beautiful about the church is the way that Jesus brings together all people, all different backgrounds, ethnicities, all nations, tribes, tongues, all political perspectives, all of that. He invites everyone, right? He has the Simon the Zealot in his 12 who is, excited to kill Roman soldiers. He has Matthew the tax collector in his 12, like just this group of people he brings are always diverse. Well, when we sort ourselves politically, we're actually going against the grain of what Jesus is trying to do. When we're a Republican church or a Democrat church or whatever, that doesn't challenge the world. That doesn't point to a reality beyond what we see. That just looks like how everything looks. Like if the world sees churches that are divided on political lines, we're like, yeah, that makes sense, you know?
Well, the church right now has such a great opportunity because our world is so divided and polarized, and everyone knows that. You don't have to be super insightful to recognize the problems we all face. So right now, the church has the opportunity to be the place where you can find unity, not because we all think alike or look alike or have the same values, the same background. No, but because we found something that transcends our differences in Jesus. And when we give Jesus our allegiance, when we say that we can worship next to someone of a different generation or a different political belief or a different race or whatever, that's what our community so badly needs. But unfortunately, we forfeited that opportunity because we tend to be as divided as anyone else. But Jesus is exalted when he brings people together, like you said, from every tongue, tribe, and nation. That's what we're going to experience for all of eternity. And so if you don't like Democrats or Republicans who are also believers, if you don't like people of different races who are also believers, you're going to hate heaven. Because that's what we're going to do, is we're going to worship Jesus and live together in community with people who are really different than us.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, I think we've sufficiently made everybody depressed about the reality of tribalism. Can we try to understand this a little bit more? Why are we like this? I think, most people intellectually can grasp that life is more complicated than just a binary of two different ways of thinking, that people are more than just their political perspectives. Like, intellectually, we know that to be true, and yet it's so easy to get sucked into the emotion of tribalism. Why does that happen to us?
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons that we can discuss, but let's start with giving yourself a little bit of grace, because we are quite literally neurologically designed to be tribal. There was a Dutch scholar named Karsten de Drew, and he was studying a chemical in our brains called oxytocin. Some people call it the love drug, because it's what your brain releases when you are bonding with someone. For example, when a mother has a child and she's holding her baby for the first time, brain scans have shown that both of their brains are releasing oxytocin. When you are romantic with someone and you feel a great passion and love for them, your brain is releasing oxytocin. Oxytocin is what bonds us to others. It's what makes us say, I'm willing to sacrifice for you. I'm willing to defend you. I want to be with you. That's what oxytocin does. And so Karsten de Drew, he saw this problem with tribalism, and he had a wild idea. What if we just put more oxytocin in the water? Problem solved, right? And so he does a test, and he has a control group of men who don't receive any oxytocin, and he has a test group of men who do receive oxytocin. And here's the wild thing. The men who get the oxytocin, they turn out to be kinder. They turned out to be more self-sacrificial. They bonded better. They got along better. It did everything it was supposed to do. But there's a catch. That group that got the oxytocin was also more willing to harm the other group. They were more willing to take from the other group if it helped their group. It turns out this drug that allows us to build cities and communities and hospitals and love and sacrifice, this chemical in our brain is also the exact same chemical that makes us want to build concentration camps, to defend ourselves against the other, to put the other on the outs. And so when you ask, why are we tribal? The answer is our brains are wired this way. Now, I think God made us tribal for good reasons. He wanted us to build Eden. He wanted us to make beautiful communities, but sin corrupts that good thing. And it turns it into an us versus them mentality.
Yeah, it's really helpful. God made us tribal. He knew what he was doing, and there's so much benefit to that. Even just belonging to a church is a form of a tribe, And so it isn't that we need to become completely other than that, but somehow it needs to be challenged, and Jesus does that. We'll get to that in a little bit. Our brains are tribal. People have been tribal forever, and yet this moment feels different, and probably everybody who's ever lived has felt that way. No one understands my life. I'm different than everybody else, but I really do think this is a different kind of moment. Am I right? Is there something else going on today that's making tribalism worse?
Well, I think you're right in that we have the opportunity to take tribalism and put it on steroids, but I think tribalism has been around as long as Genesis 3. I mean, think for a second about the story of Jesus heading to Jerusalem with his disciples, and he's going there to die, right? His disciples are super confused about what Jesus' mission is still at this point. So they're going to go through Samaria, and the Samaritans and Jews, they hate each other. They didn't really know each other. Like, Jews knew about Samaritans, but they didn't actually know Samaritans, right? So they're going to stop there, and when they get there to the village, the Samaritans, they won't let them stay because they're Jews, because the rivalry, animosity, it went both ways. And so that's when James and John, two of the disciples, say to Jesus, hey, and imagine, you're saying to the Prince of Peace, should we drop like a nuclear bomb on these people and just burn them up, right? They want to call down fire on these Samaritans. So I guess my point is that tribalism dates all the way back to biblical times. And that's good news for us in the sense that the Bible has a way out of tribalism. But let's jump to what makes tribalism so difficult today. And part of it is our ability to curate our own news. To listen to the people you want to. Part of it is because we can curate our own Facebook or social media feeds. And let me ask you this. You're on some social media platform. How much do you pay to be a part of that? That's kind of a rhetorical question because you're thinking, well, I don't pay anything to belong to Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or whatever, right? Well, why? How do they do that? I mean, they have a lot of employees. They have a lot of technical stuff that they've invested in that. Why don't you pay for it? Well, because you're not the customer. You're the product. They make money off of you. They want to keep your eyeballs on their platform so they can sell you to advertisers. So that's how they make their money. When you get something for free, it's because you're not the customer, you're the product. And what they've all learned is that the way to keep you engaged on their platform is to make you anxious, to make you sad, to make you angry. That's how they do it. Now, I'm going to read just a quote from Facebook, an internal document inside of Facebook that the Wall Street Journal got a hold of and they published. So this is Facebook talking. Are you ready? Here we go. Our algorithms exploit the human brain's attraction to divisiveness. If left unchecked, it warned, Facebook would feed users more and more divisive content in an effort to gain user attention and increase time on the platform. So their algorithm knows you, and they know what keep you engaged. And I don't mean you. I mean you, but I also mean the collective you. And the collective you is kept engaged through those negative emotions, which promote tribalism, right? Being anxious, being worried, being angry, thinking the other side is so bad. That's how they make money. So I think that is why it feels worse than it ever has.
Yeah, and social media kind of cracked the code on that a little bit of figuring out what does it take to get people to stay here longer, look at our ads, all of that, and it's all the negative emotions. It's fear, it's anger, it's, wanting to tear another group down. But it's getting used not just in social media now, it's spreading. I mean, really anywhere where you're engaging with something that's supported by ads, you're not the customer, you're the product. They're selling your time to ad companies, and they're all trying to figure out how can we make this more valuable. And usually the answer is fear, anxiety, anger, panic. So, I mean, that's why our news, television news has gone that way. That's why internet news has often gone that way as well. It's because that's how they're making money.
Yeah, and to add to that, it's helpful to realize that modern day politicians and news media organizations are in business together. I don't mean that they've signed contracts. I mean, I'm sure that's happened at some point in history. And I don't mean that it's Republicans in a deal with Republicans and Democrats in a deal with Democrats. You might not know, CNN's biggest business partner was probably Donald Trump. I'll make the case. All the way back when Donald Trump got elected, CNN was a struggling cable news network. They never got close to Fox's numbers. By the time he left office, they had the highest numbers they'd ever had in history. They were outperforming Fox at the time. Why? Because they were constantly talking about Donald Trump. He got his name in the news, and they got more viewers, not just them. The New York Times had 3 million subscribers before Donald Trump was elected. This is in 2016. By the time he left office, they had 7 million subscribers. They talked about him 10 times as much as they talked about Barack Obama. They were business partners. And you can find all different kinds of examples of this. There's a symbiotic relationship between politicians who feed off of anger and fear and anxiety, and media corporations who can buy and get your attention through fear and anxiety. And when you start to understand that that's the environment that we live in, you become a lot more sober about what you're reading online, because I'm not just reading an unbiased take on a particular issue. I'm reading a business and they're trying to sell me fear.
Yeah. All right, where do we go from here? I mean, man, our brains are tribal, the world is tribal, everybody's making money off of us being tribal.
Let's just pray.
Yeah, should we just be done?
We'll close down.
What hope do we have?
Well, it feels depressing right now, but I'm not sure that's where we should stay. You know, when Jesus is on the boat with the disciples and the storm hits them, what he says to them is, why are you afraid? Why? I'm here with you. I'm Lord over all this. The wind and waves obey me. Why are you afraid? And we, of all people, should not be afraid, because we serve a greater king. It turns out our king, Jesus, he doesn't want to become president, because that would be a huge demotion for him, right? He does not want a 4-year term. He sits on an eternal throne. So whoever wins the most votes, that's going to decide who is the next president. Right now, that looks like we're back to the same choices we had last time. That issue is going to be determined by who gets the most votes. But what the church is going to decide every day between now and that election, and between and after that election, is how Jesus is viewed by our world. And what we do every day is going to tell people that we either live in the panic, frantic, oh my gosh, the world's coming to an end, attack, accuse, or we have a peace that passes understanding, because we know who is in the boat with us. So that's part of it, is just pledging our allegiance to King Jesus instead of either political party or political candidate.
That's huge. Let's keep going on that, because what you're saying is, if we're going to escape tribalism, we actually need to replace our tribe with another tribe, right? So we're not going to get rid of it entirely, but we can choose the right tribe. And I mean, help us understand, why is that so important to get that when you follow Jesus, you're joining a new tribe?
Yeah, the tribe that Jesus has created, the church, is unlike any other tribe in human history. Two key ways, actually, it's different. Number one, it is the only tribe in human history that invites everyone. You realize that there's no qualifications. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You can be rich or you can be poor. It doesn't matter what your skin color is, what your nationality is. It does not matter. It doesn't matter what your life's been before. Jesus invites literally everyone to repent and believe in the good news. No other tribe is like that. Every other tribe has conditions. You have to have the right amount of money to go to the country club. You have to be able to afford a house to be in the HOA. You have to be of a certain ethnicity or skin color to be a part of an ethnic group. Every other tribe has qualifications. His tribe is different. There are none. All are invited. That's the first way that it's different. The second way that it's different is that most other tribes are designed to protect themselves. Who does the tribe serve? The tribe. Who does the tribe protect itself from? The people out there. Have you ever noticed that the church is different? Because of course we care for one another, but God calls us to care for people outside of our tribe. You see, Jesus' tribe is like the anti-tribe tribe. It does everything upside down. And that's why it's totally different, because it only emphasizes the good parts of tribalism and it neutralizes the bad parts of tribalism, because we are the one place where all are welcome, and we are the one place that serves all outside of our borders.
So how do we adopt that identity? I mean, how do we live into that more? What do we need to be telling ourselves and change the way that we think about the arguments we have, the political conversations, the relatives we don't want to see at Thanksgiving because we know how the conversation's going to go. I mean, all that stuff. Like, how do we live more into that reality of Jesus' tribe that you're talking about?
Well, think about what Jesus did. Jesus crossed the greatest tribal boundary, right? He came from heaven to earth. He humbled himself. He became like us. He bore our sin when we weren't interested, when we were his enemy. So how can we pursue our enemies in love? How can we think about, I want to build a bridge toward people? So in the fall of 2019, we were preaching through the book of Genesis at our church, and I preached a sermon on Genesis 1:26 and 27, which says that God made them male and female. And the best of my ability, empowered by Christ, I tried to, in the most loving, compassionate way possible, say that God created two genders. And that blew up our community. It's about 120,000 people, like Patrick said, a blue dot in a sea of red, very tribal, very polarized. I mean, I had police driving through my neighborhood just to make sure we were okay. It got nuts. And what we tried to do is we tried to just say, we're going to go out there and build bridges to people who are attacking us. So the local news station, television news station, interviewed this owner of a local bookstore, and it was early in the morning, and they were going to have a trans book discussion to somehow, I don't know, put it in my face, whatever, I don't know. And so they asked at the end, they go, well, Pastor Simon is invited. So, well, I heard about this, obviously, in our community, like in 5 minutes. I'm like, oh, well, you don't know me because I'm coming. and so I just went down there and just listened and participated and talked with them and said, which books would you want me to buy to read? Because I'm going to show you that I care about you and want the best for you. Anyone who is sane, and I didn't want to die over it, but anyone who is sane, I just got together at a local coffee shop at a Panera. And I met them there, and I just took out my paper and my pen, and I just said, what do you wish I would have known before I preached that sermon? And then I just wrote down whatever they said. I wasn't there to lecture them. I was there to listen, to win a friend, not an argument.
Slightly after that, the sermon, we were partnered with a number of arts organizations in our town, in particular a documentary film festival, one of the biggest in the country. And the film festival was incredibly progressive. So our partnership was really strange because you don't hear of many progressive film festivals and evangelical churches holding hands and singing Kumbaya and getting along, but it happened. It really happened. It was such a big deal that, the New York Times and Christianity Today, they wrote stories about it. It was just incredibly unusual. But after the sermon, it caused a lot of tension in their organization, and they ended up writing a public letter that said that they regretted having a partnership with us and that they made a mistake, and they were effectively canceling us in public. And after that happened, a few other organizations followed suit, wrote very similar things. And so we were talking to the people in our church and said, what are we going to do? I mean, what would you do? Do you punch back? You say, hey, they knew this all along. They can't pretend like they didn't know what we believed. This is ridiculous. We took a different tack. We told everybody, we want you on social media as much as possible, with your friends as much as possible, to say one thing: how much we love that film festival. How much we want people to keep going to that film festival. How we think it's great for our community because it brings in business and people from outside the city. We want you to be a part of it. We want you to volunteer it. We want you to love them in every way possible. And that's what people did. They went and they loved. About a week after that, I was spending some time with the festival's director, doing a little bit of a debrief on what had happened. And he looked at me and he said, what happened, how your church responded, that was a master class on grace. He goes, how did you guys do that? It makes no sense to me. And I wanted to say, well, we're really great people here at the Crossing, so that wasn't too hard. But I told him the truth. I said, if I'm being honest with you, there was part of me that wanted to punch back. But here's the thing. I worship a king who loved me when I was his enemy. I worship a king who came from heaven when I was rebelling against him, and he laid down his life for me. So it's actually not that complicated. The reason why we did this is because he's our master, and we do what he does. And when we did that, it broke down walls. It broke down divides. Even people who a week earlier were angry at us and upset with us, all of a sudden they said, well, I still disagree with you about that sermon, but there's something special happening there, and that special thing is Jesus.
Yeah, I think one of the mindset changes that's so huge is to recognize that tribalism is actually an opportunity for us to point to something greater. That if we're salt and light, if we're witnesses to Jesus, the tribalistic nature of the world around us gives us the platform to be able to do something differently in a way that stands out. The way that people notice when you get canceled, but instead of fighting back, you just love people. Like that, people get it. That's not how the world operates. That's not how normal people respond. Like, I was really proud of our church. We had an opportunity for that just in the last year. We were told that the Sound Transit train coming through here was likely to go through our building, and that they were going to eminent domain our property, and we didn't think that was a great idea. And so we wanted to get involved, and we asked our church to get involved and to speak up and to show up to the public forums. But what we asked was, do that in a way that lifts up the name of Jesus. Do that in a way where no matter what happens to our building, people are going to know that we're followers of Jesus and we're going to love people, even if the world might see us as enemies. And our church did that. And 1,000 people came out, represented Jesus really well, did also say, we think it's a good idea for our church to stay where it is. But I just remember talking to some of the Sound Transit folks after that, and the thing that I heard more often than anything was, we could not believe how loving your people were. We could not believe how gracious they were. We were prepared for war. Like, we were prepared, to hear a lot of nasty things and, have all kinds of anger directed towards us, and we couldn't believe it. And once again, it was a moment where we were able to say, yeah, it's because we follow Jesus. That's what Jesus is all about. That's what we're about as well. And so it was really cool to see God use that.
Yeah, it's a really cool story. I'm so encouraged by the way that you handled that. It kind of makes me think of when Jesus said, by this, they will know you are my disciples, right? By your politics is what he said, right? Oh, no, it wasn't that. By your anger, by your race? No, it was by your love for one another. And when you love one another, and then when you love your community, even when they don't deserve it, even when they're not expecting it, it says something powerful. So that's one of the things we've tried to do, is we've just tried to say, how can we do what you did? How can we love our community and just be unexpected, unsurprising, radically generous ways? And one of the things that we've all heard so much about is how medical debt has crushed people, especially people who don't have insurance, who live below the poverty line. And so what we said is, we just want to try to pay off, in partnership with this group out in New York, RIP, or Rest in Peace Medical Debt. We just want to try to pay off the medical debt of people in our county as an expression of love. And we told our congregation, if we raise $120,000, we can do that. And in 10 days, our congregation got so excited, they gave $465,000. And we were able to pay off nearly $50 million in medical debt for poor people in 38 counties in our state. And that just changed the dynamic, because if you start becoming the kind of people who radically love the outsider, radically love people who don't deserve it. And that's what we said. It was some people in our church, their first response to hearing this plan was, well, do all those people deserve it? Because don't some of them not? Because didn't they get in this position, at least some of them, by poor choices? And I'm like, well, 100%. They don't deserve it, and 100% they made poor choices. It's just, the deal is this: when Jesus came, when he came to die for me, he didn't ask who deserved it. What he did is said, you have a need, you have a debt that you can't pay. And so we're not going to use the word deserve. We're just going to say, who has a need they can't pay? And we turned around and did it on utility disconnect list. The list of people you get on and they're going to cut off your utilities. And we just said, well, in COVID, that got long. And we just went to the city and said, tell us what the amount is. It was like $200 and some thousand. So we went to the congregation and said, we can't live in a community that people are getting their utilities disconnected. And so people gave another, 400 is a big number, I guess, in our congregation. They gave another $400,000. And we gave $200 to pay off that utility disconnect list. Nobody's utilities got cut off. And we gave $200,000 to a nonprofit to help people stay off that list. So building a bridge to people and practicing a radical generosity are at least two steps toward loving people.
One of the things that happened in both those stories is that people reached out and they would ask us, why were you doing this? And not just that I didn't deserve it, but I'm shocked. Because we didn't say, hey, we're only paying off the medical debt of Christians, or we're only paying off the utility debt of people who go to church. So we had people call and they said, I'm in the LGBT community. Why in the world would you pay off my medical debt? And we could always say, well, it's because of what Jesus did for us. He paid off our debt. There are people who ended up coming to church. And they were coming not because they heard an amazing sermon, as great as your sermons are, except for that one. And they came to church because they said, if this is the kind of community that does this kind of thing for outsiders, and I want to hear more about it. It tore down dividing walls in the community. And that's where radical generosity has the way to just cut across political debates, because it doesn't matter which side you are on this thing or that thing. If we're willing to be generous to people in radical ways, they're going to be drawn, magnetized towards Jesus.
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on something really important, which is, I think often we think that Our feelings drive our behavior, but actually the reverse can be true as well, that your behavior can actually change your feelings and your emotions. And part of what you're saying is part of the cure to tribalism in your own soul is actually just obedience. It's doing what Jesus said. It's being generous with people. It's praying for your enemies, praying for those who persecute you. And I mean, even in my own life, as I think about the people I've had arguments with, the people that I haven't gotten along with, like so often I'm spending way more time arguing with them, talking to other people about them, like on and on, way more time than I'm praying for them. And yet actually when I obey, when I say, okay, I still think they're crazy, but Jesus called me to pray for them, like it actually changes your heart, it changes your soul. And it's really hard to be hateful towards someone that you're praying for. You know, it's really hard to not seek the good of a group of people that you're being generous towards. And so just obeying Jesus actually can change a lot of how we're thinking about people that we often want to cast as our enemy. We're in an election year, or so I've been told. We're looking ahead to 2024, and no doubt the emotional temperature of things are going to continue to pick up here. When you look ahead and just where the church is at today, where our country's at, are you encouraged? Are you discouraged? What would be a word for people as we head into this next season?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons to be encouraged right now. This has nothing to do with tribalism, but it does give me hope. You probably realize that Gen Z, not quite our youngest generation, but our generation in high school, college age, that range, it's the least church generation in American history. And so if you look at all the statistics, there's more people who define themselves as nones, that's N-O-N-E-S, than people who define themselves as Christians in that generation by a huge margin. And so that could lead us to believe that, Christianity is dying off here. But here's the strange thing is I talk to pastors around the country, and we're experiencing this in our church. There's something happening with Gen Z right now. If you're paying attention, you will find churches and places where just little revivals, little renewals are taking place. You can think about what happened in Asbury. It's a school in Kentucky where a group of students started a prayer meeting. It began with a chapel, and they began praying, and it just went on for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. I'm not sure. Is it 5 days it went on?
Well, I knew it was serious when they missed the Super Bowl to pray.
Yes, they missed the Super Bowl. I was not missing the Super Bowl because I'm a Chiefs fan. Anyways, but the point is, this was all student-led. And we're seeing this at our church. The amount of college students we have involved today is tremendously higher than we've ever seen before. And that's giving me great hope, because if you look at the statistics, you would say, oh my gosh, Christianity's dying out. But when you look at the people and you see the way that God is renewing hearts and minds and souls, you'll realize that even if the numbers are smaller, the hearts are bigger. And God is reaching people who are anxious. God is reaching people who are lonely. God is reaching people who have spent years on Zoom and phones. And he's saying, I've got something different for you. I've got a place where you can be in community, where you can belong, where you can experience peace. And Gen Z is craving that, and they're being transformed. So I have tremendous hope for the next generation.
Yeah, I do too. And one of the things that's really encouraging to me about the season we're in is I think that there is a way that God is putting the idol of politics to death in our society right now, where people on both sides of the aisle, they're more disillusioned about politics than I've ever seen. And that is causing a lot of despair for a lot of people. But I think when you look at it from the perspective of the church, people are coming to realize that what they've been putting their hope in isn't actually providing. It's not delivering. And that is the kind of realization that often God will use to open our eyes to our need for more, for our need for a savior, our need for an eternal reality. And so I just see a great opportunity for the church right now to provide the hope that for a long time people have wanted to come from politics, and they're just realizing that it can't any longer. And what if they turn to Jesus in that moment? What if we are here to live out the way of Jesus and to preach the message of Jesus and see what God does with that?
I think you're exactly right. Why I became a Christian because I realized that all the things I'd putting my hope in had failed me. But for years I kept putting my hope in. It took failure and hitting bottom in order to look around for something else, right? And that's probably true of a lot of our stories. And so I think you're right. Maybe now we are emotionally exhausted. We've realized that whoever you elect is not going to bring the changes that you want. And so maybe now is the time for Christians pledging their allegiance to Jesus, not the donkey or elephant, being united across all the things that divide. Now is the time for us to point people to him. And then finally it just comes down to me to Jesus is alive.
Yeah.
right? So if you have a person that's addicted in your family and you want to give up, you can't give up. Because Jesus rose from the dead, because he rose from the dead, he brings new life. He can save us. He can save you. He can do whatever he wants. Jesus is alive. Jesus reigns. And that's where our ultimate hope is in.
Amen. Well, I want to keep going, but we got to wrap this up. But we're not done. We're coming back today at 4 p.m. for a seminar from 4 to 5:30, and really excited about that. There's going to be a couple things going on. The first is going to be a presentation on this idea that we started talking about in week 1, the idea that we're exiles, we're outsiders. And you want to give just kind of a 2-sentence invite to that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stories Wyatt told us we couldn't tell in church. And he didn't really do that. But we do have some stories we wouldn't tell in church that we will tell later tonight. They're interesting. And God has blessed us to be in a church and a congregation where we've had to figure out what it looks like to be outsiders in many ways in our community. And not just outsiders who are angry at our community or fearful about our community, but outsiders who are joyful in our community, who are working for the common good in all of the spheres that God has called us in. And so this afternoon, we're going to be talking about what it means to be outsiders, why we feel like outsiders, maybe even more so today than we did 10 or 15 years ago, and how God is calling us to be outsiders in our community.
Awesome. So we'll start with that at 4, and then the second half of our time this afternoon is going to be a Q&A. And you guys get to submit the questions. It's all going to come from you. And actually right now, you can go to Slido, alderwood.cc/Slido. There's already some questions in there. You can ask your own. But even if you don't want to ask a question, you can go on and just upvote the questions that you think are the best, that you want to hear answered. And all 3 of us will be here to answer whatever questions you guys submit. So really encourage you to check that out. Hey, if you want to go deeper as well on your way out, check out our resource table. There's books for sale. Their book is out there. A couple other ones that have been influential on me as well as just some podcasts. They have a podcast called Truth Over Tribe, and there's a link to that, as well as our own podcast, Native Exiles. So I hope you'll check that out if you want to go deeper. And then just lastly, before I pray for us and get us out of here, don't forget, Easter's just right around the corner, 2 weeks from today. And so be thinking, be praying about who God has put into your life, what neighbor, what friend, what person that you work with you can invite to come and hear the gospel this Easter Sunday. We're really looking forward to that as well. I'm going to pray for us, and then we will send you out of here. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the fact that you are King, that you reign on an eternal throne that can never be taken away, that can never be shaken. And so, Lord, by your Spirit, would you just increase our confidence in that truth? In the midst of anxiety, in the midst of fear, in the midst of tribalism all around us, would you anchor our identity on you, that we are your children, called together by the blood of Christ, that we have a message and a mission that goes so far beyond our political moment today. And so we ask that you would prepare us for that you would show us the opportunities that you're giving us to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, to be generous with those in need. And Lord, would you use our church to be a city on a hill? Would you open people's eyes to their spiritual need and to the reality of Jesus in this next season? As people lose their hope in politics and in our national leaders and all of that, would you help them to find their hope in Jesus here? We want to be a part of that, Lord. And so use us however you want to. We give you all the praise and the glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for being here. See you this afternoon at 4.